The October wind cut through Boston's Back Bay neighborhood as I stood in the kitchen of my son's brownstone, arranging canapes on silver platters. My fingers, gnarled from decades of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, moved with practiced efficiency. Through the doorway, I could hear the murmur of guests arriving for Preston's 35th birthday celebration. I had raised Preston alone after his father walked out when he was 3. I cleaned houses during the day and offices at night, my knees aching on cold tile floors, my hands raw from bleach and ammonia. Every dollar I earned went toward his private school tuition, his college fund, his future. He never wanted for anything, even if it meant I wore the same 3 dresses for a decade. Now he lived in this beautiful home with his wife, Margot, and their 2 children. He worked as a senior analyst at Whitmore Financial, one of Boston's most prestigious investment firms. I was so proud of him, even though I rarely saw him anymore. He was busy. I understood that. Success demanded sacrifice. I heard his voice in the living room, loud and jovial. The party was in full swing. I finished arranging the food and prepared to slip out the back door, as I always did during their gatherings. But Margot appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer dress probably costing more than I made in 3 months. She looked at me with barely concealed impatience and said that Preston wanted me to meet someone. My heart lifted slightly. Perhaps he wanted to introduce me properly this time, not as the help, but as his mother. I followed her into the crowded living room, wiping my hands nervously on my apron. Preston stood near the fireplace with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed. As I approached, Preston turned and his smile faltered for just a moment before he plastered it back on. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave and announced to his boss that this was Judith, their housemaid. The words hit me like a physical blow. He continued, explaining that they let me stay out of pity because I was good with a mop. The room seemed to tilt. Several guests laughed politely, and I felt heat rush to my face. But then the silver-haired man's expression changed. He stepped closer to me, his eyes widening with recognition. He asked Preston if he was sure about that, saying he knew me. The room fell silent. Preston's face drained of color. He stammered, asking what his boss meant. The man, whom Preston had introduced earlier as Richard Whitmore, the firm's founder, extended his hand to me with genuine warmth. He said it was good to see me again, addressing me as Mrs. Calloway. I took his hand, my mind racing. Richard Whitmore. The name triggered a memory from 15 years ago. Chapter 2. The Recognition. Richard turned to the gathered crowd and announced that Mrs. Calloway was actually one of the most brilliant real estate investors he had ever encountered. He explained that she had consulted for several of his firm's high-net-worth clients over the years. Preston's face had gone from pale to ashen. Margot grabbed Preston's arm and whispered urgently, asking what was happening. But Preston seemed unable to speak, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Richard continued, oblivious to the family drama unfolding, recounting how I had advised one of his clients on a Boston waterfront property development that had tripled in value. The truth was more complicated than Richard knew. Yes, I had given that advice, but not as a paid consultant. I had overheard the conversation while cleaning Richard's office late one night 15 years ago. I was emptying trash cans when I heard him on a conference call, frustrated about a client who was about to make a terrible investment decision. During my lunch break the next day, I had typed up a detailed analysis of the Boston waterfront market and left it on his desk, unsigned. The advice had been taken, and the investment became legendary, but Richard had somehow figured out it was me. He explained that he had checked the security footage after finding my memo and spent months trying to track me down through the cleaning company, but I had already moved on to another job. He said he had always wanted to thank me properly. I found my voice, though it trembled. I thanked him and said I was glad the advice had been helpful. Preston finally spoke, his voice thin and strained, insisting there must be some mistake. He stated that I was just a cleaning lady, that I had barely finished high school. Richard's eyebrows rose. He asked Preston if he really did not know. The younger man looked between us, confusion and dawning horror crossing his features. I could see him beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about me was incomplete at best, a lie at worst. I made a decision in that moment. I untied my apron with shaking hands, folded it neatly, and placed it on the nearest chair. I told Preston that we needed to talk, but not here. My voice was steady now. 40 years of swallowed pride finally finding its way to the surface. Richard, sensing the tension, excused himself politely, but not before pressing his business card into my hand. He said his offer from 15 years ago still stood, if I was ever interested in consulting work. Then he left, and I was alone with my son and his guests, all of them staring. Chapter 3. The Drive Home. Preston's apartment. My apartment, technically, though he did not know that yet, was in the South End, about 20 minutes from his brownstone. I told him I would meet him there in an hour. He needed to explain to his guests that the party was over. I needed air that did not smell like betrayal. I walked to the tea station, my mind spinning. The November evening had grown colder, and I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders. I had always been good at being invisible, at moving through spaces without drawing attention. It was a survival skill I had developed over decades of cleaning other people's homes, learning their secrets, seeing their true selves when they thought no one was watching. But I had secrets too, secrets that Preston was about to learn. I took the Orange Line, watching my reflection in the dark window as the train rumbled through the tunnel. I was 72 years old, and I looked it. My hair was gray, my face lined with years of worry and hard work. My hands were permanently stained from cleaning chemicals, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. But my mind was sharp. It had always been sharp. When I arrived at the apartment building, I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the brick facade. It was a modest building by Boston standards, but well maintained. I had bought it 30 years ago with money I had saved and invested carefully, $1 at a time. It contained 6 units. I lived in one and rented out the others. Preston lived in another, though he paid far below market rate, a rate I had personally subsidized through the building's management company without his knowledge. He thought he had found a great deal through a friend of a friend. He had no idea that friend was my property manager, and that I was the owner. I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees protesting. By the time I reached my 3rd-floor apartment, Preston was already there, pacing in the hallway. Margot stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold fury. She demanded to know what was going on, insisting that I had embarrassed them in front of Preston's boss. I unlocked the door and gestured for them to come inside. My apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books and papers. Preston's eyes swept the space with growing confusion. He noted that it was different from how he remembered, asking where all the cleaning supplies had gone. I told him I had not worked as a cleaning lady for 15 years. I turned to face them both, and the words I had been holding back for so long finally came out. I explained that I stopped cleaning houses when I was 57, after I had saved and invested enough money to support myself without working my hands to the bone. Preston sank onto my couch, his face pale. He asked why I had never told him. The hurt in his voice almost broke my resolve, but I pressed on. Daughter, Chapter 4. The truth begins. I moved to the small desk in the corner of my living room and pulled out a locked metal box from the bottom drawer. My hands shook slightly as I opened it with the key I kept on a chain around my neck. Inside were decades of documents, carefully organized and preserved. I told them that I had wanted to tell Preston so many times, but he had been so ashamed of me for so long that I did not know how to bridge that gap. I explained that when he was in high school and would not let me come to his events because of what I did for a living, I understood. When he was in college and told his friends I was working overseas rather than admit I cleaned dormitories at night, I understood that too, but it still hurt. Margot's voice was sharp as she stated that Preston had every right to his feelings, suggesting that I was trying to make him feel guilty. Preston told her to stop, his voice weary. He looked at me and said he had been cruel, admitting that he knew that. I pulled out the first document, a faded newspaper clipping from 1985. I explained that before Preston was born, I had been accepted to MIT's doctoral program in economics. I had a full scholarship. His father and I had been so excited about our future. Then I got pregnant, and everything changed. Preston leaned forward, staring at the clipping. He had never known this. He asked why I had never told him. I explained that his father left because he did not want the responsibility of a child, leaving me with a choice of keeping the baby or my education. I chose him, obviously, and MIT would not defer my admission beyond 1 semester. By the time he was born, my scholarship was gone. I pulled out more documents, rejection letters from every grant program I had applied to, trying to find a way to finish my education while raising an infant alone. Letters from my parents, who had disowned me for having a child out of wedlock. A notice of eviction from my first apartment, when I could not make rent because daycare cost more than I earned. I told them that I did what I had to do and took whatever work I could find. Cleaning houses paid cash, and I could sometimes bring Preston with me when he was small. My voice broke slightly as I explained that I would prop him up in his carrier and talk to him about everything I was learning, teaching him economics and mathematics while I scrubbed floors, because I refused to let my mind atrophy just because circumstances had derailed my formal education. Margot's expression had softened slightly, but her voice remained skeptical. She asked what any of this had to do with Richard Whitmore and the consulting work he mentioned. I pulled out another set of documents, and these ones made Preston's eyes widen. Chapter 5. The Hidden Empire. I spread the papers across my coffee table. Property deeds, investment statements, business registrations. Preston picked one up with trembling hands. A deed for a small apartment building in Cambridge. He recognized the address and noted that his friend Raymond lived there. I confirmed that Raymond was one of my tenants. I owned 7 properties in the Boston area. I had started with a small duplex in Dorchester in 1995, bought with money I had saved over 10 years, living on almost nothing, investing every spare dollar I could. I explained that I taught myself real estate law, market analysis, and property management by reading books from the public library after Preston went to bed. Preston's voice was barely a whisper as he asked how this was possible. I told him that I was very good at seeing patterns and that economics was about understanding human behavior and market forces. Just because I cleaned houses did not mean I stopped thinking like an economist. I explained that over the years, I had quietly built a portfolio that now generated enough rental income to support me comfortably. I no longer needed to work, but I had continued cleaning houses for several more years, because Preston was so ashamed of me anyway that I figured it did not matter. And honestly, I added, I liked the work sometimes, as it gave me time to think and kept me invisible, allowing me to move through the world without anyone expecting anything from me. Margot was reading through the investment statements now, her eyes growing wider. She noted that some of these properties were worth millions, and asked if Preston knew about any of this. He shook his head mutely, still staring at the deed in his hands, the same hands I had held when I taught him to read, when I walked him to his first day of school, when I waved goodbye as he left for college. I told them that Preston never asked and never wanted to know anything about my life beyond whether I could babysit his children. My voice hardened as I continued, explaining that when he called me, it was to ask me to clean his house or watch his kids, and when I visited, he introduced me as the help. So no, I never told him. Preston set down the deed and put his face in his hands. His voice was muffled as he insisted that I should have told him, stating that he was my son. I responded sharply, asking if I was his mother, because he had introduced me as the maid less than 2 hours ago, and this was not the first time. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of someone crying. To my surprise, it was not me. It was Preston, his shoulders shaking with sobs. He said he was sorry, repeating it over and over. There. Chapter 6. The Price of Shame. I sat down heavily in my armchair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving only a deep, aching sadness. I had imagined this conversation many times over the years, but the reality was so much harder than I had anticipated. Preston wiped his eyes and looked at me with a rawness I had not seen since he was a child. He said he remembered when I used to help him with his homework, noting that I always knew the answers even to the hardest problems. He asked why he had never questioned where that knowledge came from. I told him that he had stopped asking me for help when he was about 12, right around the time he started to realize that other kids, mothers, did not show up to parent-teacher conferences smelling like cleaning chemicals. I explained that he had stopped inviting me to school events the next year, and by high school, he was telling people I worked overseas. I let him believe what he needed to believe. Margot spoke up, her voice quieter now and less hostile. She asked why I had not corrected them, why I let them treat me like the help. I looked at her directly and explained that it was because, in some ways, I was still the help, still the woman who had sacrificed everything for her son. Just because I had money did not change the fact that I would do anything for Preston, including letting him be ashamed of me if that was what he needed. But something had broken tonight. I continued. When he introduced me as just the maid and said they kept me around out of pity, something inside me had cracked. Because I was not the one who should have been grateful, I told him. He was living in my building, paying rent that was 2/3 below market value. His children's private school tuition, the one he and Margot had been struggling to afford. I revealed that I had been anonymously covering half of it for the past 3 years. Preston's head snapped up, his eyes wide. He asked how I knew they were struggling. I responded that I knew because I was his mother, and I paid attention even when he did not want me to. I explained that I knew because I still had access to the trust fund I had set up for him when he was born, the one he thought his father had established. His father had never given him a penny. Every dollar in that trust fund came from me, from years of minimum wage work and careful investing. Preston stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. His voice was strained as he said he did not understand why I had kept all of this secret, insisting it did not make sense. I told him that I had tried to tell him multiple times over the years. Chapter 7. The Missed Opportunities. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled down a journal, one of many I had kept over the years. I flipped to a page dated 10 years earlier and began to read the entry I had written the day I tried to tell Preston about my real estate investments. The entry described how I had invited him to lunch at a small cafe in Cambridge, how I had been so nervous that I had barely been able to eat. I had started to explain about the properties I owned, about the consulting work I had been doing quietly for years, but he had cut me off. I read aloud, answering his phone mid-conversation to take a call from work. By the time he hung up, our lunch hour was over. He had apologized, kissed my cheek, and rushed back to the office. I never brought it up again. I read another entry, from 5 years ago, when I had tried again. This time I had come to his house with all my documents, ready to show him everything. But Margot had answered the door looking exhausted, and I learned that their daughter had been up all night with a fever. The entry described how I had set aside my plans, spent the day caring for my granddaughter, and left without ever mentioning why I had really come. There were more entries like this, I told them, closing the journal. Moments when I had tried to bridge the gap, but life got in the way. Or maybe, I admitted, I had let life get in the way because I was afraid. Afraid that if Preston knew the truth, it would not change anything, that he would still be ashamed of me, but now he would resent me too for keeping secrets. Preston turned from the window, his face streaked with tears. He said that I should have tried harder, that I should have made him listen. His voice rose as he continued, insisting that he had a right to know who his mother really was. I met his anger with my own, my voice shaking but firm as I responded. I told him that he had no right to demand that I make myself heard when he had spent 20 years making it clear he did not want to hear me. I continued, explaining that every time he introduced me as the help, every time he made excuses for why I could not come to a family event, every time he looked at me with barely concealed embarrassment, he was telling me exactly how he saw me, and I heard him, loud and clear. Margot stood up, positioning herself between us. She said we were both upset and needed to calm down, suggesting we continue this conversation another time. I shook my head and stated that there was not going to be another time, not like this. I had spent 72 years accommodating other people's comfort, I explained, and I was done. Chapter 8. The Cost of Revelation. I told Preston and Margot that I wanted them to leave. I needed time to think, time to decide what came next. Preston protested, saying we needed to talk more, insisting that I could not just drop this on them and kick them out. I asked him why not, noting that he had dropped me from his life piece by piece over the years. So why could I not do the same? As they gathered their things to leave, Preston paused at the door. He said he loved me, and he knew he had not shown it well, but he did. His voice broke as he insisted I had to believe that. I looked at my son, this man I had sacrificed everything for, and I told him the truth. I said I believed he loved the idea of having a mother, loved having someone who would drop everything to help him when he needed it. But I did not think he loved me, the real me, because he never bothered to know who that person was. I continued, explaining that he loved the convenient version of me, the one who stayed small and quiet and grateful. But that was not all of who I was, and maybe it never had been. They left. I sat alone in my apartment, listening to the sounds of the building around me, footsteps overhead, muffled television voices through the wall, the distant sound of traffic on the street below. I had bought this building 3 decades ago, had built something real, and lasting with my own hands and mind. But in doing so, I had somehow lost my son. The next few weeks were difficult. Preston tried to call me multiple times, but I did not answer. I needed space to process everything, to understand my own feelings about what had happened. I spent my days walking through Boston, visiting the neighborhoods where I had worked, where I had struggled, where I had slowly built my life back up from nothing. I walked past the old triple-decker in Roxbury, where I had cleaned houses 3 times a week for 5 years, past the office building in the financial district where I had worked night shifts, polishing marble floors and emptying trash cans, past the library in Copley Square where I had spent countless hours reading every book I could find on economics, business, and investing. Each place held memories of exhaustion and determination, of a woman who refused to let circumstance define her completely. But they also held memories of loneliness, of a son who grew more distant with each passing year, of sacrifices that had bought me financial security, but cost me something far more precious. Chapter 9. Unexpected Allies. 3 weeks after the disastrous birthday party, I received a call from Richard Whitmore. He apologized for the scene at Preston's party, saying he had not meant to cause family trouble. But he also said he had been serious about his job offer. His firm was expanding their real estate investment division, and they needed someone who understood the Boston market from the ground up. I was surprised, telling him I appreciated the offer, but I was 72 years old and had not worked formally in 15 years. Richard laughed and said that was exactly why he wanted me, noting I had the kind of perspective and experience that could not be taught in business school. He told me to think about it and invited me to lunch the following week, with no pressure. I agreed to the lunch, curious despite myself. We met at a quiet restaurant in Beacon Hill, the kind of place I would never have dared enter during my cleaning days. Richard was charming and sincere, speaking about his firm's work and how my insights 15 years ago had not only saved his client's investment, but had also influenced his entire approach to real estate consulting. He told me something that surprised me. He had grown up poor in South Boston, the son of a janitor and a cafeteria worker. He had put himself through community college and then Northeastern, working multiple jobs. He understood, he said, what it meant to be invisible in spaces where people with money gathered, to see opportunities that others missed because they were too privileged to notice. That lunch turned into regular meetings. Richard became, unexpectedly, a friend. He introduced me to other people in his network, and slowly I found myself consulting on small projects, offering insights based on my decades of observing Boston's neighborhoods and their transformations. I discovered that I enjoyed it. Enjoyed using my mind in ways I had not allowed myself in years. Preston continued trying to reach me. His voicemails progressed from apologetic to frustrated to worried. Finally, after 6 weeks of silence, he showed up at my door on a Sunday morning. He looked terrible, having lost weight and developed dark circles under his eyes. He asked if we could talk, really talk this time. I let him in, and we sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped him with his homework, where I had taught him to count using dried beans, where I had sat alone night after night, planning my future, while he slept in the next room. He said he had been thinking about everything I said, about how he had treated me. He admitted he had been ashamed, not just of what I did for a living, but of himself, of where he came from. Chapter 10. Difficult Truths. Preston explained that when he got to private school on scholarship, surrounded by kids whose parents were lawyers and doctors and executives, he felt like he did not belong. He said the easiest way to fit in was to erase where he came from, to reinvent himself, and that meant erasing me too, or at least the version of me that did not fit his new narrative. I listened without interrupting as he continued. He said he told himself he was doing it for both of us, that if he could succeed and move up in the world, he could eventually take care of me. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, taking care of me had become keeping me at arm's length. It was easier to help me financially than to confront his own shame about his background. When he finished, I asked him if he knew what had hurt the most. Not the introduction at the party, I explained, though that had been painful, not even the years of distance. What hurt most was that he had never been curious about me. He had never asked about my thoughts, my dreams, what I wanted from life beyond serving him. He had never wondered how a woman who supposedly barely finished high school could help him with advanced calculus homework or give him detailed explanations of economic theory. Preston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that showed more insight than I had given him credit for. He admitted he had not asked because, on some level, he knew. He knew I was smarter than I pretended to be, more capable than I let on. And if he acknowledged that, he told me, he would have to confront how much he had taken from me, how much I had given up. It was easier to believe the lie. I felt tears welling up, the first I had cried since the party. I told him that was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. But honesty did not erase the past, I continued. It did not give me back the years I spent invisible to him, did not undo the shame he made me feel about my own life. He asked what he could do to make it right. I told him the truth. I did not know if he could. Some things, once broken, cannot be fully repaired. We could maybe build something new, I said, but it would never be what it could have been if he had seen me for who I was from the beginning. Preston's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy he had once been, the one who ran to me with every hurt and triumph. He said he was sorry, so deeply sorry. He knew it was not enough, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to do better if I would let him. Chapter 11. Fragile rebuilding. We began meeting for lunch every week. It was awkward at first, decades of hurt and habit standing between us. But slowly, we learned to talk to each other like adults, like two people trying to know each other for the first time. I told him about my work with Richard's firm, about the consulting projects I was taking on. He told me about his struggles at work, his fears about being a good father, his attempts to understand why he had become the person he was. One day, he brought his children with him. My granddaughter, Lily, was 8 years old, and my grandson, Marcus, was 5. They were beautiful children, and I ached every time I saw them because I had missed so much of their lives. Preston had kept me at a careful distance from them, allowing me to babysit but never to be a real presence. That afternoon was different. Preston told them the truth about me. Not all of it, but enough. He said I was not just their grandmother who sometimes cleaned their house, but that I was a successful businesswoman who had built everything from nothing. Lily looked at me with new eyes and asked if it was true that I owned buildings. I told her it was, and asked if she wanted to see one. We walked to the apartment building in Cambridge, the one I had bought 25 years earlier. I showed them the property, explained how I had renovated it myself, learning plumbing and electrical work from library books and helpful hardware store employees. I told them about the tenants who had become like family over the years, about the pride I felt in providing people with safe, affordable homes. Marcus asked if I was rich. I laughed and said I had enough, which was all anyone really needed. Lily asked why I had cleaned houses if I owned buildings. I told her that I had cleaned houses so I could own buildings, that every sacrifice had a purpose. Every hard day had been an investment in the future. Preston watched this conversation with tears in his eyes. Later, after we had taken the children for ice cream and returned them to Margot, he thanked me. He said seeing me through his children's eyes helped him see what he had missed all these years. I told him I was glad, but that it still hurt, that seeing my grandchildren's excitement about discovering who I really was only highlighted how much of their lives I had already missed. The consulting work with Richard's firm grew more substantial. I found myself energized by the intellectual challenge, by the respect I received from colleagues who saw my mind rather than my age or my history. But I was also tired. 72 years of living, of fighting, of carrying the weight of secrets and shame, had taken their toll. Laughter, Chapter 12. The Bittersweet Resolution. A year after the disastrous birthday party, Preston threw another celebration, this time for my 73rd birthday. It was a small gathering at his home, just family and a few close friends. But this time, when he introduced me, he said something different. He told his guests that this was his mother, Judith Calloway, one of the smartest people he had ever known, and someone he had spent too many years taking for granted. He spoke about my real estate investments, my consulting work, the sacrifices I had made. His voice broke several times, and when he finished, he simply said he was sorry it had taken him so long to see me. The guests applauded politely, but I knew the words were really for me. After the party, Preston and I sat alone in his living room. He said he wished he could go back and do everything differently, that he would give anything to erase the years of shame and distance. I took his hand, feeling the calluses from his work on his keyboard, so different from my own work, worn hands but still, somehow, familiar. I told him we could not go back. That was not how life worked. But we could go forward, differently this time. I explained that I was proud of him, of the man he was trying to become, even if I grieved for the years we lost. He asked if I forgave him. I said forgiveness was complicated, that I was working on it, but that some hurts ran too deep to ever fully heal. He accepted that answer with a sad nod. We sat in silence for a while, and then I told him something I had been thinking about for months. I was changing my will, I explained. The properties, the investments, everything I had built. I was setting up trusts for Lily and Marcus, for their education, their futures, but I was requiring that Preston work with the trustees, that he be involved in managing the properties, that he learn the business I had built. Preston started to protest, saying he did not want my money. That was not why he was trying to rebuild our relationship. I cut him off gently and explained that it was not about the money. It was about him understanding, finally, who I was and what I had accomplished. It was about him learning to see value in the work I did, even when that work was invisible to everyone else. More importantly, I continued, I wanted my grandchildren to know their grandmother's story. All of it. The struggles and the triumphs, the sacrifices and the successes. I wanted them to understand that worth was not determined by job titles or social status, that intelligence and capability could exist anywhere, even in the hands that scrubbed other people's floors. Preston agreed, tears streaming down his face. Over the following months, he kept his word. He spent hours with me learning about property management, about the Boston real estate market, about the investment strategies I had developed. We became, in some ways, colleagues, but the easy intimacy that should have existed between mother and son had been damaged too badly to fully restore. There were good days when we laughed together, and I caught glimpses of what could have been. And there were hard days when the weight of lost years pressed down on both of us. My grandchildren began to know me better, and that brought me joy. But it was a joy tinged with sorrow for all the birthdays, school plays, and quiet moments I had missed. I continued my consulting work, finding purpose and intellectual fulfillment in my 70s that I had been denied in my younger years. Richard Whitmore became a true friend, one of the few people who saw me completely and valued me for exactly who I was. The irony was not lost on me that a stranger had recognized my worth before my own son did. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has happened, I understand that some stories do not have neat, happy endings. Preston and I have built something new, but it stands on the foundation of what was broken. We cannot erase the past, and the scars remain. I have learned to accept that forgiveness is not a single act but a continuous process, and some days I am further along than others. I have also learned that being seen, truly seen, is one of life's most fundamental needs. For decades, I made myself invisible to protect my son from the shame he felt about our circumstances. But in doing so, I taught him that I was worth hiding. That is a lesson I can never fully undo, no matter how hard we both try now. My legacy is complicated. I built an empire from nothing, proving that brilliance exists in unexpected places. But I also raised a son who learned to be ashamed of where he came from, and that failure weighs on me. The properties I accumulated will provide for my grandchildren's futures, but they cannot buy back the time I lost with them or repair the fractured relationship with Preston. Life, I have learned, is rarely fair, and sacrifice does not always yield the returns we hope for. You can do everything right and still end up with a heart full of regret, but you continue anyway, because that is what survival demands. You find moments of joy where you can build what you are able to build, and accept that perfection is an illusion sold by people who have never had to scrub floors to survive. Preston tries now, and that matters. My grandchildren know me, and that matters too. But late at night, when I am alone in my apartment surrounded by the evidence of everything I built, I sometimes wonder what my life would have looked like if I had been seen from the beginning, if my intelligence had been recognized, nurtured, celebrated instead of hidden away like something shameful. These are the thoughts of an old woman who has lived a full life, but cannot help mourning the one she might have had. And perhaps that is the most honest ending I can offer. Not triumph or tragedy, but simply the complicated, bittersweet reality of a life lived in the margins, seen too late by the one person whose vision mattered most. The buildings I own will stand long after I am gone. The investments I made will secure my grandchildren's futures. The consulting work I do will influence Boston's development for years to come. But the years I spent invisible, the brilliance I hid, the relationship with my son that broke before it could fully form, those things cannot be undone. This is my story, neither heroic nor tragic, but simply true. A story of a woman who built an empire while being dismissed as just the maid, who sacrificed everything for a son who learned to be ashamed of her sacrifices, and who found recognition only when she stopped hiding. It is a story without a perfect ending, because life rarely provides those, but it is mine, and I have learned, finally, to claim it. Epilogue. 5 years have passed since that birthday party, and I am now 77 years old. The arthritis in my hands has worsened, making it difficult to type the detailed property analyses I once produced with ease. My knees protest every climb up the stairs to my apartment. My body is finally catching up to the decades of hard labor I put it through, demanding payment for all those years I pushed it beyond its limits. But my mind remains sharp, perhaps sharper than ever now that I no longer hide it away. I am sitting in my apartment on a cold February morning, watching snow fall over Boston. The city looks different from up here, cleaner and softer under its white blanket. I have always loved snow, the way it covers everything equally, making no distinctions between the wealthy neighborhoods and the struggling ones, between the pristine and the worn. Preston is coming for lunch today, as he does every Sunday now. It has become our ritual. This weekly gathering that started tentatively and has slowly grown into something essential for both of us. He brings the grandchildren when he can, and we spend the afternoon talking, sometimes about business, sometimes about nothing in particular. The conversation still carries the weight of everything unsaid, everything that cannot be unsaid, but we have learned to exist within that tension. Last month, Lily turned 13. She came to me asking questions about investment strategies for a school project on entrepreneurship. As I explained compound interest and risk assessment, I watched her eyes light up with understanding, and I saw myself in her, that same hunger for knowledge, that same quick grasp of complex concepts. But unlike me, she is growing up in a world that will not require her to hide her intelligence to survive. I have been teaching her about the properties I own, taking her to visit the buildings, introducing her to the tenants, explaining the delicate balance of maintaining affordable housing while keeping a property profitable. She asks questions that Preston never asked, questions that show she is thinking not just about the money, but about the responsibility that comes with it. She wants to know about the families who live in my buildings, about how I choose tenants, about what happens when someone cannot pay rent. I tell her the truth, that I have never evicted a single tenant without first trying to help them find a solution, that I have quietly covered rent for families going through hard times, just as I quietly covered so many of Preston's expenses over the years, that buildings are not just investments, but homes, and homes are where people build their lives. She listens with an intensity that reminds me of myself at the library all those years ago, absorbing everything I could learn. Marcus, now 10, is different from his sister. He is artistic and sensitive, more interested in drawing the buildings than understanding their financial structures. But he too has begun to see me differently. Last week, he asked if he could interview me for a school project about someone who had overcome obstacles. As I recounted my story for him, watching him scribble notes in his careful handwriting, I realized that this was what I had wanted all along. Not recognition from the world, but to be truly known by the people I loved. The consulting work with Richard's firm continues, though I have scaled back my hours. Richard himself retired last year, but we still meet for coffee every Wednesday morning at a small cafe in Cambridge. We talk about the changing city, about gentrification and development, about the tension between progress and preservation. He understands, in ways Preston still struggles to, what it means to watch your city transform while carrying memories of what it used to be. Through Richard, I have met others like us, people who built themselves up from nothing, who carry the knowledge of invisibility even as they achieve visibility. We form an informal network, advising younger investors, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, helping them navigate a world that still assumes intelligence and capability come with the right credentials and the right background. I think about credentials often these days. I never did finish that PhD from MIT, never got the formal recognition of my abilities. For years, that felt like a wound, a piece of myself that had been amputated, but I have come to understand that credentials are for others, to help them see what they might otherwise miss. I know what I am capable of, and that has to be enough. Preston's career has had its own complications. After the revelation at his birthday party, word spread at Whitmore Financial about his family situation. Some colleagues were sympathetic, impressed even by my story. Others saw it as a mark against him, suggesting that he had misrepresented his background. The incident made him realize how much of his professional identity had been built on hiding his origins, and the foundation proved shakier than he had hoped. 2 years ago, he made a difficult decision. He left Whitmore Financial and joined a smaller firm that focused on affordable housing development. The pay cut was significant, and Margot struggled with it at first. They had to downsize their home, pull back on expenses. But Preston told me it was the first time in his career that he felt like he was doing work that mattered, work that connected to where he came from rather than running away from it. I helped him with the transition, not financially, but strategically. I introduced him to my network, shared my knowledge of Boston's neighborhoods, taught him to see the city the way I had learned to see it, as a collection of communities, each with its own rhythms and needs. We became, in a way we never were before, partners. Not mother and son, exactly. That relationship remains too damaged for such simple labels, but collaborators, building something together. Margot and I have developed our own complicated relationship. She apologized to me about 6 months after the birthday party incident, and I could see it cost her something. She admitted that she had encouraged Preston's distance from me, thinking it was what he needed to succeed in their social circle. She had grown up with money, with parents who belonged to country clubs and sent their children to boarding schools. She had not understood, she said, what it meant to claw your way up from nothing. I accepted her apology but told her that understanding now did not erase the years of condescension, the subtle ways she had made me feel small in my own son's home. We are cordial now, sometimes even warm, but there is a carefulness between us that probably will never disappear. She is trying, and I suppose that is all any of us can do. The properties I own have become a more public part of my identity. A local journalist wrote an article about me last year, calling me Boston's secret real estate maven. The piece focused on how I had built a successful portfolio while working as a cleaning lady, framing it as an inspirational story of the American dream. I gave the interview but found myself uncomfortable with the narrative they created. The American dream, as it is usually sold, suggests that hard work and intelligence automatically lead to success and recognition. But my story is not that simple. I succeeded because I was brilliant and determined. Yes, but also because I was willing to remain invisible for decades, because I accepted circumstances that should never have been acceptable. The dream requires someone to clean the floors of its grand houses, and those people rarely get to build their own dreams until they have already given the best years of their lives to someone else's. The journalist did not want to hear that complexity. They wanted a neat story about overcoming obstacles, about triumph. They did not want to discuss the cost of that triumph, the relationships damaged, the years lost, the bitterness that comes with late recognition. So the article was published with a hopeful tone that felt dishonest to me, and I declined all subsequent interview requests. I have been thinking about legacy more as I grow older, and my body reminds me daily that time is finite. The buildings will outlast me, and the trusts I have established for Lily and Marcus will provide for them, but I wonder sometimes what lessons they will take from my life. Will they see a woman who built something remarkable from nothing? Or will they see a woman who had to hide who she was to survive, who sacrificed so much for a son who learned to be ashamed of her? Perhaps they will see both, and perhaps that is the truest version of my story. Life is not a single narrative, but a collection of contradictions that we must somehow hold simultaneously. I still walk through Boston regularly, though more slowly now. I visit the old neighborhoods where I worked, the houses where I cleaned floors and scrubbed toilets while my mind raced with calculations and plans. Some of those houses are still there. Others have been torn down and replaced with luxury condos that I could afford to buy, but never would. The families I worked for have mostly moved away or passed on. I am a ghost in my own history, walking through spaces where I once existed, but left no visible mark. There is one house I visit more than the others, a Victorian in Jamaica Plain where I worked 3 days a week for nearly 8 years. The family who lived there, the Hendersons, were kind to me in their way. They paid on time, left me alone to do my work, even gave me a small Christmas bonus each year. They had 3 children who grew up during the years I cleaned their home, and I watched them transform from messy children to teenagers to young adults. I never told them I had a PhD acceptance from MIT in my past. I never mentioned that I owned property or that I could explain complex economic theories. To them, I was simply Judith, the cleaning lady who showed up faithfully and did good work. They were not cruel, not like some of the families I worked for. They simply never thought to wonder if I might be more than I appeared. The house was sold 5 years ago, and the new owners do not know I have any connection to it. Sometimes I stand across the street and look at the windows I used to wash, the porch I used to sweep, and I think about the woman I was then. She feels both intimately familiar and completely foreign to me now. I mourn her, and I am proud of her, and I am angry on her behalf, all at the same time. Preston asks me sometimes if I regret the path my life took, if I wish I had made different choices. It is a question I have asked myself countless times, usually late at night when sleep will not come, and my mind wanders through the landscape of what-ifs. If I had not gotten pregnant, I would have finished my PhD. I would have built a career in economics or academia. I would have had recognition, respect, the validation of credentials and titles. But I would not have had Preston, would not have my grandchildren, would not have learned the particular lessons that come from being invisible in plain sight. If I had told Preston the truth earlier, forced him to confront who I really was, would it have changed anything? Or would it have pushed him further away, made the gap between us unbridgeable? I cannot know, and the not knowing is its own kind of torture. I tell Preston that I do not regret having him, and that is true. But I do regret that the world made me choose between being a mother and being a scholar, between survival and recognition. I regret that I had to hide my intelligence to avoid threatening the people whose houses I cleaned. I regret that my son learned to be ashamed of me before he learned to be proud of me. These regrets are not about the choices I made, but about a world that forced those choices upon me. There are good moments now, moments when I can almost forget the years of pain. Last month, Lily gave a presentation at her school about her grandmother, the real estate investor who had built an empire from nothing. Preston recorded it and showed me, and I watched my granddaughter speak with pride about my accomplishments. She talked about the buildings I owned, the tenants I housed, the consulting work I did. She talked about the MIT acceptance I had to turn down, and the decades I spent cleaning houses while building my portfolio. But what struck me most was when she talked about what she had learned from my story. She said she learned that being smart was not enough, that you also had to be brave and strategic and willing to wait for your moment. She said she learned that success could look different from what society expected, and that sometimes the most important work was invisible. She said she learned that you could be reduced to a single role, a maid, a mother, a grandmother, and still contain multitudes. I cried watching that video, and when Lily came to visit that weekend, I held her tight and told her I was proud of her. She asked if it made me sad, talking about everything I had given up. I told her the truth, that sadness and pride could exist together, that life was rarely simple enough for single emotions. She nodded with a maturity beyond her years and said she understood. I think perhaps she did. The building I live in, the first property I ever bought, will be her responsibility someday. I have been training her in its management, teaching her about the systems I established, introducing her to the tenants who have become like family. She takes notes in a small journal, not unlike the journals I kept throughout my life, and I see myself in her so clearly it aches. Marcus shows less interest in the business side, but he has created a series of drawings of my buildings, each one rendered with careful attention to detail. He sees them as I see them, not just as investments but as structures with history and meaning, places where people live their lives. His drawings hang in my apartment now, and sometimes I stare at them and see my life's work reflected back through his artistic eyes. Preston and I had a difficult conversation last month. He asked me directly if I had forgiven him for the years of shame and distance. I took a long time before answering, wanting to be honest rather than comforting. I told him that forgiveness was not a binary state, not something you achieved once and then possessed forever. I explained that some days I felt I had forgiven him completely, understood the complicated forces that shaped his choices. Other days, the hurt was as fresh as it had been 5 years ago, and I could barely look at him without feeling the weight of everything we had lost. I told him that I was learning to live with that ambiguity, to accept that our relationship would always carry the scars of those years. I could love him and be angry with him. I could be proud of the man he was becoming and grieve for the man he could have been if he had learned different lessons. Preston cried, as he often does now during our difficult conversations. He has become more emotionally available, more willing to sit with uncomfortable feelings. He said he wished he could give me certainty, wished he could earn my complete forgiveness. I told him that was not how healing worked, that some wounds left permanent marks even as they closed. We sat in silence after that, and then he asked if I thought we would ever have a normal mother-son relationship. I almost laughed at the question because what is normal when you have built a relationship on secrets and shame, when recognition came decades too late? But I understood what he meant. He wanted to know if we could ever move past this, ever exist, without the weight of history pressing down on every interaction. I told him we were building something new, and it would have to be enough. We could not have the relationship we might have had if things had been different from the start. That was gone, lost to time and choices that could not be unmade. But we could have this. Weekly lunches, honest conversations, collaboration on work that mattered, shared love for his children. It was not what either of us had dreamed of, but it was real, and it was ours. The truth I have come to understand is that life rarely provides the endings we want. Stories demand resolution, neat conclusions where all the threads are tied up and every question is answered. But real life is messier than that. Real life is learning to live with ambiguity, with relationships that are simultaneously healing and still wounded, with pride and regret coexisting in the same heart. I built an empire while being dismissed as just a maid. I raised a son who learned to be ashamed of me. I sacrificed my education and my recognition for his future. These facts are all true simultaneously, and no amount of reconciliation can change what happened or erase the cost of those choices. But I am also here, at 77, still sharp and still building. I have grandchildren who know me and value me. I have work that challenges me, and colleagues who respect me. I have property that provides housing for families, and wealth that will support future generations. And I have a son who is trying, imperfectly, but genuinely, to see me and value me in ways he could not before. Is it enough? Some days, yes. Some days, no. The question itself may be the wrong one to ask. Perhaps what matters is not whether it is enough, but simply that it is what I have, that I survived and built something meaningful despite everything that tried to diminish me. I look out my window at the city I have watched transform over 7 decades. The Boston I knew as a young woman is gone, replaced by a city I barely recognize sometimes. The neighborhoods where I cleaned houses have been gentrified. The families I worked for have dispersed. The version of myself who scrubbed floors while dreaming of a different life has faded into memory. But the buildings remain. The investments I made, the strategies I developed, the empire I built. These things are real and lasting. They stand as proof that I existed, that I mattered, that invisible work can have visible results if you are patient and strategic and willing to wait for your moment. Preston arrives for lunch, bringing soup from my favorite deli and fresh bread from the bakery in the North End. The grandchildren are with Margot today, so it is just the two of us. We eat and talk about his latest project, an affordable housing development in Dorchester that is facing community opposition. I offer suggestions based on my experience, point out pitfalls he has not considered, share stories about similar projects I consulted on years ago. As we talk, I watch my son's face and I see glimpses of the boy he once was, the child I held and taught and sacrificed everything for, and I see the man he has become, flawed and trying, carrying his own regrets and his own hopes for redemption. We cannot go back and fix what was broken. We can only move forward, building something new on the ruins of what might have been. When he leaves, he hugs me at the door and tells me he loves me. I say it back because it is true, even though that love is complicated by hurt and disappointment and all the years we lost. Love is not always enough to heal everything, but it is what we have, and so we offer it to each other, imperfect and incomplete. I return to my window and watch the snow continue to fall. The city looks peaceful under its white blanket, all the sharp edges and hard truths temporarily softened. But I know that beneath the snow, Boston is still Boston, beautiful and brutal, offering opportunity and demanding sacrifice. transforming constantly while carrying the weight of its history. I am part of that history now, part of the story of this city. Not in the official records or the history books, but in the buildings I own, in the families I have housed, in the grandchildren I am teaching to see value beyond credentials and status. My legacy is written in brick and mortar, in investment portfolios and rental agreements, in the lessons I pass on about survival and strategy and the high cost of invisibility, and perhaps that is enough. Not everything I hoped for, not the recognition I deserved, not the relationship with my son that I sacrificed so much to enable, but enough. A life lived fully, with intelligence and determination and love, even when that love was not returned in the ways I needed. The snow falls on Boston, covering everything equally, making no distinctions. And I sit in my apartment, 77 years old and tired, but still here, still sharp, still building. This is my story, neither triumph nor tragedy, but simply the complicated truth of a life lived in the margins and the center simultaneously, invisible and influential, dismissed and essential. This is what it means to be human, to carry contradictions, to live with ambiguity, to build meaning from the materials life provides, even when those materials are insufficient, to love imperfectly and be loved imperfectly in return, to survive and to grieve what survival cost, to be proud and regretful, satisfied and longing, at peace and still wounded. I am all of these things. I built an empire while being called just a maid. I raised a son who learned too late to value me. I sacrificed everything and gained something, though not everything I hoped for. And now, as the snow falls and my life moves toward its conclusion, I understand that this bittersweet complexity is not a failure of my story, but its truest expression. Some endings are not happy or sad, but simply real. This is mine, and I claim it, with all its imperfections and all its truth.